Welcome to Trial Site News podcast series. We are pleased to introduce Dr. Irfan Khan, CEO of Circuit Clinical. And today we will be discussing navigating clinical research site operations as COVID-19 clamps its tentacles around the world and trial continuity during this COVID-19 pandemic. So, Doctor, welcome.
Thanks, Adrian. Great to be here.
The pleasure is ours. So, let's start off with this question, which is, what is an integrated research organization, or IRO, and how is Circuit Clinical positioned in this space?
Yeah, I think that what's happened is that there's been a recognition that clinical research needs to broaden its scope and to reach out into places where it traditionally hasn't been done. So an integrated research organization's philosophy is to bring clinical research to where people get their healthcare. So it means integrating with physician practices. It means integrating with hospitals and health systems that want to bring research in an organized, measurable way to their patients, and to let them have that option in their care practice. And so a part of it is understanding what those practices, hospitals, health systems need, and then giving them an a la carte menu that enables them to succeed with clinical trials.
So what did Circuit do to accommodate for trial continuity during this COVID-19 pandemic?
The first focus was on safety of the team and safety of the patients. So when we first got any kind of inkling that this was a serious situation, we certainly put our own activities on pause to sort of make sure that we understood what the overall guidelines were going to be from our state and federal governments. And what we realized was that clearly clinical trials fall inside an essential function.
Yes.
And what was incredibly heartening was how focused our care teams were on delivering research care to patients. So what ended up happening was we ended up stratifying what are activities that we feel are appropriate to bring patients in for versus activities that can wait until the travel ban is lifted and it's safe to have people coming in for elective type procedures. So it was a default to people on active investigational protocols versus putting a hold on screening and things like this. It was the switch to working remotely, which has certainly been an education for me. I have traditionally been from the school that suggests that team culture is built in the office and remote work complicates that whole framework. And I've been very pleasantly surprised. I think that just like the rest of the country, life on Zoom seems to be working pretty well.
Well, and I think it helps that people are taking it seriously and they want to participate. I think people still want to be able to work and to connect with people, whether it's telecommuting or in person.
So well put. We've actually seen productivity across the company go up as a result of all of this, and I think you nailed it. I think that there is a clear understanding, and not just in Circuit, but across the clinical trials community at every level, the sponsors, the CROs, the sites, that this is an opportunity for us to really, really focus our value-creating steps and to really make sure that the ecosystem stays as intact as possible during this unprecedented time.
Agreed. So for our audience, can you describe what virtual engagement means to Circuit?
I think it's a spectrum, and I think thinking of virtualization or decentralization, we approach it as trying to figure out what are the trade-offs between being fully virtual, which is appropriate for some visits and indeed some entire studies, and what are the trade-offs. And so are there things that really do need to happen at the office? Are there things that could be mitigated by having a visiting nurse? And this is where the integrated research model is a good one for these times, because we do believe in an idea bringing clinical trials as local to the patient as possible. And that boundary has now been pushed local, meaning right at home. And so between telehealth visits and virtual visits, between looking into really having research care happen right at home through our staff, making that visit, this has been an interesting time because it's really helped us develop new and important capabilities in response to the challenge.
So let's talk about preventing participants from dropping out of studies and improving engagement. What can sponsors and CROs do to help this?
Well, I think that's a billion-dollar question whose impact is going to be felt here over the next 6 to 10 months, and possibly with even greater impact if we see another round of COVID or something like it in the fall, winter. So I agree with you. The framing I use is that every single clinical trial is functionally in rescue right now, whether it knows it or not, because with everybody's lives as disrupted as they've been, what happens to the motivation to continue to come to that next visit when they are finally allowed to go back to their doctor's office or their research site center? what happens to the desire to stay in the trial for the next 2 years, given the length and given the disruption that's already happened. And so I think what needs to happen is that every stakeholder needs to focus on taking actions that improve engagement. At the site level, that's reaching out directly to patients, and I think right now the simplest way to do that is phone call and or managing your online presence. I do think this is an area that we spend a lot of time on with our Trial Scout platform, that capturing patient experience, really getting that voice out there to help us understand, where does motivation sit right now? Where does engagement sit? How likely are people to continue in their clinical trial? That's a critical question, and understanding that and really asking for that information from patients and sharing that in a way that lets everybody learn and benefit from it. I think that's going to be one of the critical challenges in the year ahead.
Agreed. So shifting a little bit here, we see a lot of stimuluses going on in. Do research sites need a stimulus for business to continue after COVID-19?
It's a wonderful framing. I would certainly say that the research site is the core of the ecosystem, and it's important that we have a healthy site ecosystem. And so there are things that the sponsors and CROs can do, in this case, making payments in a timely manner with as little friction as possible, and communicating clearly with the sites in terms of what the expectations are. Here are the steps we're taking so that there's good guidance. Certainly at Circuit, we've been very pleased that our sponsors have bent over backwards to facilitate on both of those counts. I think that's important. I think that the sites themselves are going to have to adopt some new techniques, and I've been very heartened by what we've seen from our friends across the industry in terms of, almost overnight embracing virtual visits and trying to figure out how do we look for the tools that are out there and that have been out there, and how do we use these tools to improve our connection to our patients. I think that every action that can be taken by the state and federal governments to preserve and strengthen the site ecosystems, that's a very solid move that pays strong dividends. We know the economic impact from clinical trials in a state is extremely high. It's measured in the billions of dollars in places like Texas and Florida, even New York. And the idea that we would let that core infrastructure, the research site or the site network, fail as a result of this disruption, that would have long-term consequences, clearly on the health of the people of that state, but also on the economic infrastructure that clinical trials create, that halo that clinical trials as an industry creates.
So on that note then, where do you see the future in clinical research going post-COVID-19, and what changes can the industry expect?
Well, I think two voices that have spoken on this really resonate. Craig Lipset, who in full disclosure sits on Circuit's board, so I may have more access to the Pfizer's former head of innovation than most. He's framed this very, very accurately publicly, which is to say that it isn't that we have the infrastructure to suddenly change the industry overnight. When this relaxes, it isn't like suddenly every single trial is going to be 100% virtual. But it will be important for the sites to be able to provide some flexibility to sponsors and CROs to be able to say, yes, we can take visits 2 and 7 and make those virtual if everyone feels that's in the best interest, or we're going to be able to flex to a virtual decentralized hybrid where some of the visits can occur at their general medicine doctor's office, some can occur at home. Those are going to be important new capabilities that sites are going to need to develop as we move to a world in which it isn't so much we're all moving virtual, but it may be that we're all moving into a space where we need to be flexible and need to be able to respond to what's happening in the environment, in the broader environment. I think Kelly McKee from Vertex, who runs patient recruitment for them, has a great phrase from the patient's perspective and says patients should be allowed to choose their own adventure. And in that, and choose their own experience, really, when it comes to clinical trials. Maybe they want to have some visits at home, but maybe they want to see their doctor at least occasionally, and maybe they want to go to a full-blown academic research site for certain procedures. And the right sites and the right sponsors are going to be challenged to figure out how to do that. And the reward for doing those two things, both of which hinge around choice. If you listen to what Craig and Kelly have to say on this, what they're really saying is that successful sponsors and successful sites of the future are going to be really strong on being able to provide choice in that experience, in that hybrid nature of clinical trials. That's, I think that between those two ideas is the future of clinical trials.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. Choice is going to be crucial. And you can even see when you're talking about how we're evolving, you can see the nimbleness even in the regulatory side. I mean, we're moving heaven and earth to make this more effective. And what's the long-term effectiveness, and will clinical trials go backwards, especially seeing how we can get things done faster?
I read and I share that wholeheartedly, Adrian. I read a line from Michelle Longmire of Medable that I just loved. She said, necessity isn't just the mother of invention, it's also the mother of adoption. And that's a really key point, that I think that what's happened here as a result of this is that the regulatory framework has realized that we have to make it easier to adopt new innovations to allow us to do these things in response to a crisis that can really sort of change the entire landscape in a matter of weeks. And so I think that COVID-19 has served as a mother of adoption here. And I think what we'll see is that while there may be a move to go back and look at the regulatory framework and say, well, okay, we allowed this, but we do need to put a few more guardrails around this. I don't think we're going to see them say, we allowed this for the 6-month window, but we're taking that away and we're not going to go back to that anymore. I think the benefits are really clear to patients. Anybody who's had any kind of telehealth experience with their doctor in the last few weeks, I'm sure is thinking about, hey, this actually was pretty good. And how do I make this part of my healthcare going forward? I think we'll see the same thing in research care, that there'll be this desire to have some of the experience decentralized, completely virtual. But I don't think the desire to see our doctors and nurses is going away, and maybe I have a bias being a cardiologist, but I think there is some utility to the office visit as well.
So what then is the best outcome that can happen post-pandemic?
That's a great question. I think the ideal state for the patient would be an ability to participate in a clinical trial that was easy for them to find online, one in which they could have their voice heard about what the experience was like to participate, and that when they were participating, they experienced a great deal of personal flexibility in scheduling visits either at home, at their doctor's office, or at a particular research site. I think that would be an ideal state for the patient, in which communication was really strong, there was trust and transparency. That's the ideal state for the patient. For the sites, I think the ideal state will be that we're going to have sponsors and CROs understand economic realities of running sites and site networks, and they're going to understand that this is the core of the ecosystem, that if the site economics collapse, the clinical trials industry will rapidly collapse too. And so there needs to be this partnership to find a working solution in which virtualization and decentralized visits are part of the equation, but that the site economics don't collapse. I think the ideal state there is the sites commit to creating flexibility and choice for the sponsors and CROs, and the sponsors and CROs commit to creating economic frameworks that work for the sites. And then, I guess, taking that one circle out, I think at the level of the sponsors and the CROs, the ideal state is having access to a set of sites and site networks that clearly understand that the future planning is going to require some understanding of the risk of disruption and some capability sets already online at work inside that site that can absorb that disruption and say, oh, we're switching these visits to virtual now. I think that's the future evolves to, which is sites and site networks that can provide sponsors with a variety of options to solve the problems on the fly is good for the patients, and it's good for drug discovery.
So finally then, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, talking about the stimulus for business, but what can industry stakeholders do to rescue their studies and get back on track?
I think it starts with understanding that the time to care about engagement is right now, not 6 months from now when everyone is understanding that their dropout rate, which used to be in the 1 in 5 range, is now approaching 40 or 50%. The language our sponsors use now accurately is the data gap. And that this disruption, and by the time it all resolves and the wheels start to come back online, that gap in missing elements may be as large as 30%. And it could expand if we have a difficult fall winter, and that could jeopardize hundreds of programs. So right now, the question to ask yourself is, as a sponsor, is the study you're doing actively, is it active and is it disrupted? And I think the broad spectrum of the industry is going to answer that question, yes, to most of the trials they're doing. And so that to me suggests that what needs to happen, because the only solution to that data gap, preventing it from expanding and ideally helping it shrink as fast as possible, is engaged patients who haven't given up on the idea of being in that trial, patients who are looking for that trial still for some reason, and making it easier for them to get to that trial. I think that's the engaged patient. And I will say that I personally believe that engagement, we say the word a lot without actually getting to a clear definition. But if we look at what's happening in the consumer health space, we know what engagement is. The people who have been selling us things on the internet have known what engagement is for 15 years.
Yeah.
Engagement is not a push. It's not an email from me to you. Those have astonishingly low open rates and response rates. That's a push is not enough, and it's not a pull. It's not me just surveying you and taking that information behind a wall and hiding it away. Engagement is really a two-way interaction where an opinion is sought, the voice is heard in some public way that's useful, and that person understands that they play an important part in this whole thing, that the participant is really the whole point of the trial industry and the critical contributor. And so I think the idea is that where we sit right now is the right sponsors who are looking at this problem in front of them realize solving for engagement now is a way to minimize the tremendous impact this disruption is going to have on the dropout rates and the retention rates going forward.
Absolutely. Well, and engagement, it builds trust and it builds investment with the individuals you're connecting with. So yeah, that's absolutely right.
I think the site is just a wonderful space. It's a wonderful place for trust and transparency. The stuff we do with Trial Scout in terms of really providing the sites a way to tell their story, that is a response to kind of an unmet need. It came from, friends of mine in the site industry telling me that people were reviewing them on Google and on Yelp. And the reason that happens is because patients don't really have an easy place to share a great research experience. There's really no forum for it. And in that space, and there's other excellent solutions in this space to give patients a voice, I think helping them realize that sharing how they feel about their trial, how likely they are to come back, what are the barriers, those kinds of things. I think being able to capture that learning and share it with everybody, I think that's a powerful thing. And I think it's got a real role to play in solving for the problem that's kind of brewing right in front of us.
Agreed. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Khan. We appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule to speak with us.
Adrian, thanks so much. It was a great time. Appreciate it.
The pleasure is ours.